She had 5 bodyguards, a private elevator, and a security system that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. None of it saved her. When the cable snapped and the car began to fall, every single one of those highly trained professionals was on the wrong floor. 46 stories of empty air beneath her feet, and the only person who came running was a maintenance worker in a gray uniform, a quiet man nobody ever looked at twice. What they didn't know was what he used to be, and what he was about to do would change both of their lives forever. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories find you. Stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight. We drop new ones every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming. Before we dive in, do me a favor, drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The elevator was supposed to be the safest one in the building. That was the thing Grant Holloway kept turning over in his mind later, not while it was happening, because there was no time to think about anything except the next 30 seconds. But afterward, sitting in the parking garage with his hands still shaking and the smell of burned wiring stuck in the back of his throat, that was the detail that wouldn't leave him alone. The safest elevator in the building. He'd worked at Carrington Aerospace for 3 years. So every mechanical room, every utility corridor, every access panel that the building's official schematics either got wrong or forgot to include entirely. He knew which freight elevator ran hot in summers and which bathroom on the 12th floor had a slow drain that maintenance kept patching instead of fixing properly. He knew this building the way you know a place when you show up before anyone else arrives and leave after most people have already gone home. He did not know Evelyn Carrington, not recently. He'd seen her, the way you see someone who exists in a completely different atmosphere. She moved through the lobby, sometimes in the early mornings, her heels clicking on the polished concrete, a phone pressed to her ear or a tablet in her hand, 3 or 4 people orbiting her at all times, like she had her own gravity. She was 30 years old, which Grant always found slightly difficult to accept, not because she seemed young, but because she carried herself with the particular kind of exhaustion that usually only arrived after decades of fighting for something. He had never spoken to her. He didn't expect that to change. That Tuesday started the way most Tuesdays started for Grant Holloway. His alarm went off at 5:15. He lay still for exactly 45 seconds, an old habit, military, checking the room before moving, and then he got up, because there was no reason not to. The apartment was quiet. Sophie's door was still closed, her little sneakers lined up in the hallway outside it, toes pointing toward the wall the way she always left them. He made coffee. He made her lunch turkey and cheese, the crusts cut off, an apple sliced thin, because she didn't like biting into a whole one. He wrote him a note and left it on the counter next to her cereal bowl, the same way he did every morning she had school. Bus at 7:40. Mrs. Patterson has the spare key. Call me at lunch if you need anything. Dad, she was 8 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and a gap between her front teeth from a baby tooth she'd lost in March that still hadn't fully grown back in. She collected erasers shaped like animals and kept them in a shoebox under her bed, and she had recently decided, with complete seriousness, that her career goal was to become a marine biologist who also played professional soccer. Grant thought both options were entirely possible. He kissed her forehead without waking her, pulled her door almost closed, and left for work. By 6:30, he was in the building's basement mechanical room, running his morning check of the elevator hydraulic systems. It was the kind of work most people didn't think about, the systems hidden inside the walls, the infantry trucks that made a 46-floor aerospace company function without anyone upstairs ever having to wonder whether it would function. Grant had learned a long time ago that the most important things were usually the ones nobody noticed until they stopped working. No, he was replacing a worn coupling on the secondary freight elevator when Marcus came in, 22 years old, and still new enough that he walked fast to seem busy. You hear about the drill today? Marcus asked, not really asking, just talking. He did that a lot. Security exercise, Grant said, without looking up from the coupling. Executive level. 46. They're running some kind of emergency response simulation with Carrington herself. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. You believe they shut down half the building's camera feeds for a drill. Security director's orders. Did look up then. Just briefly. Which cameras? Marcus shrugged. Executive elevator bank. Private car. Some of the corridor feeds on 44 through 46. He pulled out his phone. Seems like overkill for a drill. Yeah, Grant said. He turned back to the coupling. But something had shifted at the back of his mind. Not an alarm exactly. More like a frequency. A very old, very familiar sensation that he had spent years trying to quiet. He finished the coupling. He noted it in his log. He moved on to the next item on his checklist. He told himself it was nothing. The first sign that it wasn't nothing came at 10:47 in the morning. Yes, he'd intervened. Grant was on the 23rd floor, running conduit through a utility chase, when he felt rather than heard something wrong in the building. A vibration pattern through the walls that didn't belong to any of the systems he knew. Yes, it was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss entirely if you hadn't spent years learning to listen to structures, to understand the language of steel and cable and mechanical load under stress. He stopped working, stood still. There it was again. An elevator running normally. Not the building settling. Something faster, and getting faster. He was already moving before he fully understood why. The maintenance stairs between floors were his. Every landing, every door, the exact weight of each fire door, and how hard you had to push. He took them 3 at a time going up, and he was at the elevator equipment room on the mechanical floor above 46 in under 4 minutes. He would have been faster, but he had to go around the 28th floor, where a water main repair had blocked the stairwell access. The equipment room was locked. He had a master key. He was inside in under 6 seconds. The private executive elevator, Evelyn Carrington's car, was showing a fault on the panel that made Grant's stomach drop straight through the floor. The emergency braking system, the electromagnetic failsafe that was supposed to engage automatically if the car exceeded safe descent speed, was reading as disabled. Malfunctioning, disabled. Someone had taken it offline deliberately. He grabbed the radio from his belt. "Control, this is Holloway. I need you to." Static. Complete dead air. He tried his cell phone. Signal. Not degraded, completely absent, like something was actively blocking it. He looked at the elevator speed monitor. The car was falling at 4 times normal descent rate and accelerating. Grant did not think about what he did next. Thinking was for when you had time. He yanked the equipment room's shaft access panel off its hinges, looked down into the dark vertical tunnel of the elevator shaft, 46 floors of cable and counterweight, and the rushing air of something falling too fast. And he went in. There are things the human body will do under extreme stress that seem, from the outside, like they defy explanation. Grant had learned in another life that this wasn't magic, and it wasn't superhuman. It was training encoded so deep in the muscle and bone that it bypassed the conscious mind entirely. His hands found the maintenance ladder saw on the shaft wall. He descended fast, controlled the way you descend when the alternative is not surviving. The sound inside the shaft was violent. The falling car created a pressure wave of air, a roaring that filled everything, and the cables vibrated with a frequency he could feel in his teeth. He gave himself 10 seconds to calculate. Car speed, his position, the distance to the emergency brake chassis on the roof of the elevator car. He let go of the ladder. He fell, and he landed on the roof of the descending elevator car with both feet, bent his knees to absorb the impact, and did not fall off. Later, he would not be able to fully explain how. At the time, he didn't try. The brake circuit access panel on the roof of the elevator car was in the rear left corner, a gray metal plate the size of a laptop computer. Grant had serviced it twice in 3 years, routine maintenance checks that nobody ever thought much about. He had it open in 8 seconds. Inside, he found exactly what he'd been afraid he'd find. The emergency brake electromagnetic relay had been bypassed, bypassed, deliberately, professionally. Someone who knew elevator systems had gone in there and wired around the failsafe spoke to planning and time and patience. The car was still accelerating. He had approximately 90 seconds before they hit the basement pit at a speed that would kill everyone inside. Grant's hands moved. He didn't have tools for this. He had a multi-tool on his belt, and the knowledge inside his head, and whatever cable he could repurpose from the bypass itself. His fingers found the relay housing. He could see what had been done. Reversing it was possible, barely. The shaft blurred around him. The roaring was enormous. "Come on," he said. To himself, to the relay, to nobody in particular. The first connection. The second. The car lurched. A full stop, the emergency brake engaged partially, a screaming mechanical resistance that slowed the descent violently and threw Grant sideways across the roof. He caught the safety railing with one hand, his legs swinging out over nothing, 50 feet of empty shaft below him before the car started slowing. Slower, slower. The car stopped. 14 feet above the basement pit. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Grant had ever heard. No. He gave himself 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a luxury. He allowed himself because his hands were shaking, and his shoulder hurt from where he'd caught the railing, and he needed to remember what came next. What came next was the person inside the car. He found the roof hatch, yanked it open, and dropped into the interior of the executive elevator. Evelyn Carrington was standing with her back, pressed against the far wall of the elevator car. She was wearing a dark gray blazer, one heel broken, her phone in her hand with the dead screen telling her everything she already knew about the communications blackout. She had a cut on her palm. She'd grabbed the railing when the car lurched, and there was a smear of blood on her wrist. She was also, Grant noticed, not screaming, not collapsed. She was standing upright, eyes wide, breathing hard, but she was looking at him, assessing. He dropped from the ceiling hatch and landed on the elevator floor. They stared at each other. She spoke first. "You came from the roof," she said. A question. "Yes, ma'am." "Through the shaft." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him at the gray maintenance uniform, the company ID clipped to his chest, the grease on his knuckles, from 3 years of working on this building's guts. He could see her trying to process what she was looking at. "You fixed it," she said. "Partially. It'll hold, but we need to get out of the shaft before." "Before what?" He hesitated half a second too long. "Before whoever disabled it realizes it didn't finish the job." The color in her face, which had started to come back, went away again. "This wasn't mechanical failure," she said. "No, ma'am." She closed her eyes, just for a moment, then opened them. "What do we do?" He had not expected that. He'd expected arguments or shock or the kind of paralysis that hit people who had never been in genuine danger. She just looked at him with those dark eyes and asked what to do, and he made a decision in the same instant. "We don't go back to the lobby," he said. "Not yet. I need to show you something first." The ventilation access panel between the elevator shaft and the secondary mechanical corridor on the basement level was something Grant had discovered 2 years ago during a humidity control project that had taken him into every crawl space and utility gap in the lower building. The official schematics didn't show it. That was the point. He got the shaft door levered open manually. There was a release mechanism for exactly this kind of situation, and he'd known where it was and helped Evelyn through the gap into the corridor beyond. She didn't ask for help. She also didn't refuse it. The mechanical corridor was narrow, lit by a single emergency strip along the ceiling, smelling of concrete and old electrical insulation. Evelyn followed him, her one intact heel clicking unevenly against the floor because she hadn't taken it off yet. "Your radio doesn't work," she said behind him. Not accusing, observing. Building-wide communication disruption. Cell and radio both. That's not possible without deliberate interference. "Yes, ma'am. Stop calling me, ma'am." "Sorry." She almost said something. He could hear it, the almost. "Then, where are we going?" "There's a hardwired emergency phone 2 corridors over. It runs on a separate analog line that bypasses the building's main communication system. If they've blocked the radio frequencies, the analog line should still work, where every emergency phone in this building is. It's my job to know." Evelyn said nothing to that for a moment. "What's your name?" "Holloway." "Grant Holloway." "How long have you worked here, Grant?" 3 years. They turned a corner. He stopped, held up one hand. She stopped immediately without asking why. He noticed that too. He'd heard something. Down the corridor, a head movement, and not the building kind. The sound of someone trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. "Step back," he said quietly. "What's—" She stepped back. He moved forward. The ventilation housing unit halfway down the corridor was large enough to conceal a man if that man crouched behind it, which was exactly what the man in maintenance coveralls was doing when Grant came around the corner. The thing was, Grant recognized the coveralls. He wore the same brand, the same color. He knew the patches they used, the company logo placement, the wear pattern on the fabric from actual work. These coveralls were new. The knees weren't dirty. The cuffs weren't frayed. The man came up from behind the housing unit fast, and he was holding something that maintenance workers didn't generally carry. What happened in the next 11 seconds was not clean or elegant, or anything like the way fights looked in movies. Grant moved left, took the man's weapon arm at the wrist with both hands, redirected, and put him into the concrete wall with controlled force. The man went down. The weapon, a compact pistol with a suppressor that told Grant everything he needed to know about how serious this was, skittered across the floor. Grant kicked it well out of reach and looked at the man on the ground. Unconscious. He'd live. He turned around. Evelyn was standing exactly where he'd left her, 10 feet back, and she was looking at him the way people looked at a landscape that turned out to be different from the map. "You're not a maintenance worker," she said. It wasn't what she'd meant to say, he could tell. It was what came out. "I am a maintenance worker," he said. "I'm also—" He stopped. Started again. "I used to be something else." He picked up his radio, checked it again, still dead, and gestured back the way they'd come. "I'll explain while we move. We can't stay here." He told her the short version. The version, with only the facts, none of the weight. Navy SEAL, 12 years of service. 9 years ago, a mission in a part of the world he couldn't name, with 4 teammates. 2 of them didn't come home, a man named Daniel Reeves and a man named Chris Ortega, both of whom had wives and children, and futures they never got to live. He stopped there. The longer version, the version where he explained what he believed about why they died, and who he'd blamed for 9 years, that version could wait. After that, he said, "I separated from the Navy. Got married, had a daughter. My wife got sick." He paused. "She died when Sophie was 3. Evelyn didn't say she was sorry. She'd started too. He heard the reflex, and then she didn't. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. So you do maintenance work," she said. "Sophie needs a father who comes home every night. That's not compatible with the kind of work that uses what I know how to do." They were moving through the secondary utility passage that ran along the building's east spine. Grant kept his eyes moving, reading every shadow, every junction ahead. The same ancient calculation running in the background of every other thought: exits, threats, obstacles, escape routes. "My security director designed this morning's drill," Evelyn said. She wasn't talking to him exactly, working it out. "Victor Sloan," he specified the executive elevator. He specified the timeline. He pulled the camera feeds. "Do you trust him?" She didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "I've known Victor for 4 years. He came from federal law enforcement. His references were—" She stopped. "I ordered an internal audit 3 weeks ago. Financial review of our defense procurement contracts. Some of the numbers weren't adding up." "What kind of numbers?" "Classified components, technology transfers. There were routing patterns in the accounts that looked like—" She paused. "Like someone was using our procurement channels to move classified technology to outside buyers through a network of shell companies." The audit was quiet. Very few people knew about it. "Victor knew," Grant said. "Victor knew." They stopped at a junction. 2 corridors branching left and right. Grant listened. Left sounded empty. Right had that same quality of deliberate quiet he'd heard before, the wrong kind of silence. "Left," he said. They went left. "The emergency phone is about 3 minutes this way," he said. "When we get communications back, the first call you make is to federal law enforcement, not local police. Local channels may be compromised." "You think this goes that far?" "Someone shut down a building's worth of communications, bypassed a Billionaire's elevator safety system, and planted armed men in the maintenance passages." He glanced back at her. "How far would you think it goes?" She was quiet for a step or two. "Far," she said. "Yeah, they found the device in the ventilation junction at corridor B7. It was the size and shape of a standard junction box, which was the point. You'd walk right past it." Grant almost did. But he'd installed the original junction box in that exact location 18 months ago, and this one had an extra seam along the left edge that the original hadn't. He stopped, held up his hand again. Evelyn stopped. He crouched down, looked at the seam without touching it, and felt the cold recognition of something he hadn't seen in 9 years, but knew immediately. "Touch it," he said. "What is it?" "It's not for us. It's for later." He straightened up. "It's set to destroy the ventilation control system on the lower 4 floors. Take out the air handlers, the fire suppression pressure, and the elevator control backups all at once. Complete systems failure." He looked at her. Whoever designed this planned for the elevator to be the first event, not the only one. Evelyn stared at the box. Her jaw was tight. "This was supposed to look like a catastrophic building systems failure," she said. "An accident," he said. "Not a murder." She turned and looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Panic. Not even fear exactly. Something harder than that and colder. "I need to get communications back," she said. "And I need everything on those servers protected. Victor's been in my system. If he has remote access to the procurement database." "One thing at a time," Grant said. She nodded, once sharp. They kept moving. The emergency phone was a red handset mounted inside a gray steel housing on the wall at the intersection of corridors B7 and C3. Grant had tested it himself 8 months ago during a routine life safety inspection. He'd confirmed it worked. He'd signed off on the log. He opened the housing, lifted the handset, dial tone. The sound of it, steady and analog and completely ordinary, hit him in a way he wasn't expecting. 3 years of maintenance work, and this was the first time he'd ever been genuinely relieved to hear a dial tone. He handed the phone to Evelyn. She dialed from memory a number she clearly knew, without looking it up, and waited. "Ring 2. This is Carrington," she said. Her voice had changed. The slight unsteadiness from the elevator was gone. She sounded like the woman he'd seen in the lobby, the one with the gravity. "I need federal contact, not local. I have a situation at the Carrington Aerospace Building, and it involves classified procurement data. Get me someone who knows what that means." A pause. "I understand. Tell them to come in quiet. I have reason to believe the building's communications and security are compromised from the inside." Another pause. "Yes, tell them to hurry." She hung up. She looked at the handset for a moment, then at Grant. 12 minutes, she said. "Maybe 15. Okay. That's not fast enough to protect the servers." "I know." She looked at him steadily. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. "We can't just wait here," she said. Grant thought about Sophie's sneakers lined up in the hallway. On the counter. "Call me at lunch if you need anything," he said. Probably not. Outside the corridor, somewhere above them in the building, he heard the sound of footsteps, more than one pair, moving with purpose. They knew the elevator had failed. They knew the first phase hadn't worked, which meant they were moving to the second phase. Grant looked at the ceiling, tracing into his mind the layout of the floors above the passages he knew, the ones they didn't, the route back up through the building's hidden infrastructure. "There's a way up through the east maintenance shaft," he said. "It's not on any official building plan. It comes out behind the server room on 38. Evelyn looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I built the access panel myself," he said. "And I never filed the paperwork." It was not the kind of answer that inspired confidence. Exactly. But she looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the elevator, measuring, deciding, and she nodded. "Show me," she said. And Grant Holloway, maintenance worker, quiet single father, former SEAL, led the most powerful woman in the building back into the dark places that nobody else knew existed. The footsteps above them grew louder. Somewhere on the 38th floor, a server was already beginning to transmit data to an address nobody was supposed to know. And Victor Sloan, the man who knew every piece of Evelyn Carrington's security apparatus because he had built it, was watching a monitor and waiting for confirmation that his first plan had worked. Yes, he was still waiting, and somewhere below him, in the walls of the building he thought he controlled completely, something was coming back up. The east maintenance shaft smelled like old concrete and something metallic, not blood. Just the particular mineral bitterness of a building's hidden infrastructure. The smell of places that existed entirely outside human awareness. Grant went first. He always went first. The shaft was narrow enough that his shoulders brushed both walls when he climbed, and the rungs of the built-in ladder were cold under his palms. Above him, the building rose in darkness. Below, the basement corridor they'd left behind was already quiet again, which was either good or very bad, and he didn't know which yet. Evelyn climbed behind him without complaint. He'd half expected her to struggle. She was wearing the remains of professional dress, one intact heel, a blazer, not designed for vertical movement through a concrete shaft. But she climbed steadily, and when her heel caught on a rung and scraped metal, she freed it herself and kept moving without saying anything. He found that he kept noticing things like that. The way she didn't waste words. The way she looked at problems the same way he did not. Why is this happening, but what do I do next? Executive, he worked for enough of them in a previous life. And this one, to understand the type. Most of them, when things went genuinely wrong, discovered very quickly that their authority was only as real as the systems, propping it up. Strip away the phones and the staff and the security detail, and you found out what was actually underneath. What was underneath Evelyn Carrington was something Grant hadn't expected to find. He filed that away and focused on the shaft. 23 floors. They stopped twice once at a junction where the shaft branched, Grant taking a moment to listen in both directions before choosing left, and once when a vibration moved through the building's frame that he felt before he heard it. Footsteps. A lot of them. One floor above and tracking left, which meant they were moving toward the main elevator bank, not the utility passages. Security sweep, he said quietly, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry through the wall. They're looking for us in the wrong place. For now, Evelyn said. For now. They kept climbing. The access panel Grant had installed himself was at floor 38, recessed into the shaft wall on the west side. A gray metal rectangle indistinguishable from the concrete around it, unless you knew the exact spot, which Grant did, because he'd measured it himself, and marked scratchings with 3 small scratches in the concrete above the left corner hinge that looked like wear but weren't. He pressed the release point, a mechanism he'd built from repurposed hardware, with 0 documentation and 0 witnesses, and the panel swung inward. Cold air from the 38th floor utility corridor hit them both. Clean and climate controlled, which meant they were back inside the building's active infrastructure. The hum of electronics, the particular white noise quality of a floor full of servers. Grant went through first, checked the corridor in both directions, then helped Evelyn through the gap. She came through fast, landed with more grace than her remaining heel had any right to allow, and straightened her jacket with the reflexive motion of someone whose body did professional before her brain could catch up. Where's the server room? She asked. 40 meters, turn right. And the access? I have a maintenance key. But if Victor's team has already been there, then we deal with it, she said, and started walking. He caught up with her in 2 steps. You want to walk in front of me? It's my company, she said, and it's my job to make sure you survive the next hour. She glanced at him sideways. Something moved across her face, not quite amusement, not quite irritation. Somewhere in between. Fine, but you don't slow down to protect me. We move at the same pace. Understood, they moved. The server room on 38 was behind a card access door with a secondary keypad, 2-factor authentication, standard for infrastructure housing procurement data at the classification level Carrington Aerospace operated. The card reader was still green. Evelyn pressed her palm to the secondary pad, and the door clicked open. They went inside. The room was cold the way server rooms always were, the air dry and faintly charged with the smell of electronics working hard. Rows of rack-mounted servers ran the length of the room, status lights blinking in the blue-green rhythm of normal operation. At the far end, one workstation terminal was active, its screen showing an ongoing data transfer that filled the display with a progress bar and a cascade of file pathway names scrolling past faster than you could read them individually. Evelyn crossed the room in 8 steps and put her hands on the workstation keyboard. It's already running, she said, and her voice had gone flat in a way that told Grant she'd been hoping, just slightly, that they'd gotten here in time to prevent this, rather than interrupt it. 41% transferred. Grant looked at the screen. The destination address was a string of numbers that meant nothing to him as an identifier. The routing structure was familiar. It was going through a relay, directly, which meant tracing it would take time and technical resources neither of them had right now. No. Can you stop it? He asked. I can stop the transfer from this end. It won't recall what's already moved. Her fingers were already on the keyboard. If I isolate these servers, the receiving end loses access. 41% of a procurement database is either everything or almost nothing, depending on what they prioritized. What would Victor prioritize? The technology transfer records, the shell company routing, the contract approvals with my signature on them. She stopped typing for a second. He'd intervened. He'd want the things that could implicate me as much as the things that implicate him. It's cleaner if this looks like a fraud I was running. Grant absorbed that, so stopping it at 41%. They have enough to muddy the water, but not enough to build the full picture they wanted. She looked at him. It also means investigators get 60% of the actual evidence with clean provenance. I can work with that. She went back to the keyboard. Her movements were quick and deliberate. She knew this system, knew exactly what she was doing. And Grant stood back and let her do it because this was her territory, the same way the shaft behind the walls was his. 40 seconds later, the progress bar on the screen stopped moving. A prompt appeared. Transfer interrupted, server cluster isolated. Evelyn let out a breath. Not relief exactly. The particular exhalation of someone who had just paid a very expensive bill and knew it was the right thing but still felt the cost. Done, she said. Good. Grant was already at the server room door, listening through it. We need to move. They'll know the transfer stopped. How fast? Fast enough that we shouldn't be standing in the server room when they come to find out why. She took one more look at the terminal, at the frozen progress bar, the isolated server status, the frozen evidence of everything Victor Sloan had spent months building, and then she turned and followed Grant back out into the corridor. The door sealed behind them with a sound like something closing permanently. They'd gone maybe 30 feet down the corridor when Grant heard it. Footsteps this time. A radio, someone else's radio, briefly unsuppressed, a burst of static, and two words that carried through the building's recycled air with perfect clarity. Confirmed transfer stopped, and then another voice, further away, answering. Find them. Grant put his hand on Evelyn's arm and pulled her left into the junction corridor that ran along the building's north face. His hand on her arm was brief and practical, and she moved with it without argument. How many, she asked, very quietly. At least 2 communicating. More elsewhere. He thought about the floor layout. He'd worked 38 during an HVAC retrofit 4 months ago. The way he knew most of this building, not perfectly, but well enough. There's a fire door at the end of this corridor. Past it, the stairwell. But they'll have the stairwells by now. So we don't use the stairwell. There's another option. He pointed up the plenum space above the drop ceiling. It runs the full floor plate. Access panel is, he counted doors. Third maintenance closet on the right. She looked at the ceiling, at the smooth gray expanse of drop ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights that hid, 1.5 feet above, the building's entire nervous system ductwork and conduit and cable trays running unseen from one end to the other. I'm not small, she said. You don't have to be. I've been up there. It's wider than it looks. She looked at him. You've been in the ceiling of this floor, changing a splice in the fiber conduit. About 3 months ago. She absorbed this for a moment, the particular quality of his knowledge, the way it was everywhere, and invisible and exactly useful now. All right, she said. They moved. The maintenance closet was unlocked, because maintenance closets were Grant's domain, and he kept them on his master key, not the security system. He went in, climbed the built-in shelving on the left wall, and pushed the ceiling tile directly above it, up and to the side. The gap above was dark and smelled of dust and cable insulation and warm electronics. He went up. Then he reached back down. Evelyn took his hand and climbed the shelving, and he pulled when she needed it, and she got through the gap with considerably more composure than the situation deserved. They lay side by side in the ceiling space, the drop tile pulled back into place. Below them, the floor 38 infrastructure humming around them in the dark. For a moment, they were both completely still. Both listening. Grant could hear his own pulse, slower than it should have been old response, but the body, deciding that stillness required stillness, and beside him he could hear Evelyn, breathing, controlled and deliberate. 2 of them, she said, barely above a whisper, below us. He'd heard it too. Footsteps and the low exchange of 2 voices that couldn't quite be made out, but had the cadence of coordination, someone telling someone else to check the next corridor, someone confirming. They moved through the space below, unhurried, systematic. These weren't panicked men improvising. They had a plan for this contingency too. Victor, Grant thought, had prepared for a lot of possibilities. What Victor hadn't prepared for was a maintenance worker who'd been quietly learning this building's hidden geography 3 years. The voices faded. The footsteps tracked east, away from their position. Grant gave it 60 seconds. Then he tapped Evelyn's arm once and began moving through the ceiling space. He's crawling on hands and knees over the cable trays, navigating by memory, and the occasional dim rectangle of light coming up through the gaps where tiles didn't sit perfectly flush. Evelyn said quietly behind him, "Yeah, you said 2 teammates. On the mission." He kept moving. His hands and found the next cable tray, stepped over it. What were their names? He hadn't expected that question. Here, not now, not from someone who'd known him for less than 2 hours and was currently crawling through a building ceiling with blood drying on her palm. "Reeves," he said, "and Ortega." She was quiet for a moment. He heard her navigating the same cable tray behind him. "How long have you been carrying that?" she asked. It wasn't the question he expected either. Not what happened or how did they die. Just how long, as if the weight was the important part. 9 years, he said, another pause. "That's a long time," she said. He didn't answer that, 'cause yeah, it was. They kept moving through the dark above the floor where men with weapons were looking for them. And Grant Holloway carried what he'd carried for 9 years and kept his hands on the cable trays and kept going. The plenum space ran 50 feet north before Grant found the access he was looking for, a service junction where the HVAC ductwork widened into a distribution plenum, creating a space large enough to move through vertically for about 8 feet before it narrowed again. More importantly, it sat directly above the fire stair, access on the building's northeast corner, a stair that building management had quietly decommissioned 4 years ago during a space conversion project, kept sealed and off the active egress maps, but structurally intact and accessible from the mechanical infrastructure. Grant had found it during his first year. He'd told nobody, because nobody had asked him, because there was something he'd come to value at about having exits that weren't on the map. He worked the duct panel, loose from inside, as lowered himself through it into the sealed stair landing, and helped Evelyn down after him. They were in a dim concrete stairwell that smelled of disuse and old paint. A single emergency battery light cast everything in amber. The stairs went down sealed doors on every landing and up to a door on the 40th floor that Grant knew from testing was improperly latched. The mechanism corroded enough that his master key would push it regardless. Tar it senti, Evelyn looked around the stairwell with the expression of someone who was recalibrating. Again, what this building actually was versus what it appeared to be on any official document. "Does anyone know about this?" she asked. "Probably the people who bricked it up," he said. "Buddy active. Including Victor's team. I'd guess so, yeah." She leaned against the wall for a moment. Not collapsing, just taking 5 seconds to be somewhere safe, or something approximating it, which was the first 5 seconds like that they'd had since the elevator. Her hair had come mostly loose from whatever it had started the day in. The cut on her palm had dried. She looked like someone who had been through something real, which she had. "Tell me about the mission," she said. "The one where they died." Grant looked at her. "We have time," she said. "We can't move up until they've cleared this floor or committed to a different position. 5 minutes, maybe 10. She met his eyes. "Tell me." He sat down on the stairs. Not because he wanted to, but because she was right about the time, and because something in him, something he hadn't consulted, had already decided to. "We were operating in support of an intelligence asset extraction," he said. "A source who'd spent 2 years building access to a weapons procurement network. The mission was to get him out before his cover collapsed. We had solid intelligence on the extraction route, the timing, the safe house sequence. Everything looked clean." Evelyn listened. She didn't interrupt. "What we didn't know," Grant said, "was that our communications had been compromised at the source. Our equipment, the network we were communicating through. Someone upstream had access and had been feeding modified information to our command element. By the time we reached the extraction point, the route we thought was secure had been walked by people who were waiting for us." He stopped. The old images were there. They were always there. You didn't really stop seeing them. You just learned to look at them without going under Reeves, going left when he should have gone right, because the intel said clear Ortega at the back of the stack when the intersection opened up wrong. No. Reeves went first, he said. Ortega was 60 seconds behind. I was the team leader. I gave the order to move on the compromised route. Because you had bad information, Evelyn said. Because I had information I thought was good. He looked at the concrete wall across from him. For 9 years I've known there's a difference. And for 9 years it hasn't helped. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You left the Navy because of that. I left the Navy because Sophie needed a father, he said. Yeah, also because of that. And you've been doing maintenance work in a building where you know every hidden corridor and every unofficial access panel and every system that could be used to move someone safely through a crisis. She paused. For 3 years. I like the work, he said. Grant, he looked at her. You've been ready, she said. The whole time you've been here, you've been ready. You just didn't know for what. He didn't have an answer for that. He thought about Sophie's note on the counter, about the bus stop at 7 on 40, and the sliced up spoons and the boxes of erasers shaped like animals. He thought about the man he'd been before, all of that, and the man he'd become, and whether there was actually a clean line between them, or whether he'd just been telling himself there was one. We should move, he said. She didn't push it. She stood up. She asked. Up, he said, but not the server floor. Have it covered now, he thought. Victor's priority is 2 things: confirming the evidence transfer completed and managing the building until external access is controlled. He'll need a communication point that isn't jammed, somewhere he can coordinate with whoever's on the outside of this. His office is on 44, Evelyn said, but he'd know that's too obvious. The executive conference suite, Grant said. 44 northeast corner. It has a hardwired satellite uplink for board calls, independent of the building's main comms infrastructure. Evelyn stared at him. It was installed 2 years ago, he said. I did the cabling. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Quite too much tension in it, but almost. Of course you did, she said. If Victor's using it, it means he has communication with the outside when nobody else does. It also means he knows federal response is coming. He'll have timed this. He's working toward a window. How long? We made the emergency call 35 minutes ago. Federal response to a classified data incident. Quiet approach. He calculated. Be outside the building. Staging. Maybe 10 minutes from breach. Victor has 10 minutes to finish whatever he started. And so do we, Grant said. He started up the stairs. They'd gone 6 floors in the decommissioned stairwell, moving quietly, listening at each sealed landing. Grant's hand on the door at 40 to confirm the corroded latch before pushing through when they heard the shot. One shot, suppressed, the distinctive compressed crack of a weapon with a suppressor that still wasn't actually silent, no matter what the movies suggested. It came from somewhere on 44, muffled through 2 floors of concrete and steel, but unmistakable to anyone who'd heard it before. Evelyn stopped moving. Grant was already calculating. 1 shot suppressed, executive floor. Not a firefight, a single controlled action. Victor eliminating a complication, or warning someone, or his radio crackled. They both froze. The radio on his belt, the building maintenance radio that had been dead since the communications blackout began, crackled once, twice, and then resolved into a signal. Weak, barely there, riding what sounded like a frequency significantly different from the standard building channels. A voice came through. Old, measured, the voice of someone who had learned long ago to sound steady when things were anything but. If someone in this building can hear me, this is Warren Maddox. I'm on the 44th floor. I have a message for whoever's still trying to stop what's happening. Tell them about the Halcyon network. Tell them to look at the Halcyon network. Static. Then the signal dropped again and the radio went dead. Grant and Evelyn stood in the sealed stairwell 2 floors below the 44th and looked at each other in the amber light. Maddox, Evelyn said. Her voice had changed. Warren Maddox is a board member. Retired admiral. He was supposed to be. She stopped. He was supposed to be on 44 this morning for the quarterly board briefing. I forgot he'd be there. Victor didn't, Grant said. The implication settled between them without needing to be spoken. Victor had the satellite uplink. He had armed men distributed through the building. He had a communications blackout and a 10-minute window He had a retired admiral on the 44th floor who knew something about a network called Halcyon and was using a jury-rigged frequencies to send messages to anyone still in the walls. "We have to go up," Evelyn said. "I know." Grant. She said his name the way people said a name when they needed the person attached to it to be fully present. Whatever Halcyon is, if Maddox is transmitting it on an open frequency, he thinks it matters enough to risk telling Victor he's communicating. Which means he thinks it matters more than his own safety, Grant said. Yes. Grant looked up the stairwell. 44 was 2 floors above them, the door sealed and corroded like the others. Beyond it, Victor, armed men, a retired admiral who'd just broadcast his position, a satellite uplink counting down toward a window that was closing, and whatever the Halcyon network was. He thought, briefly and without meaning to, about the morning. On the counter, the sliced apples, Sophie's sneakers in the hallway. "Call me at lunch if you need anything." "Okay," he said. He started climbing. The door to 44 required more force than the others. The corrosion was worse. And he had to put his shoulder into it twice before the latch gave, which was loud enough that he went through fast and moved left immediately. Because loud was an invitation and he wasn't interested in accepting one. The 44th floor executive corridor was different from the utility spaces they'd been moving through. Carpeted, lit. The kind of space designed to communicate power and stability wide hallways, dark wood paneling, the glass walls of conference rooms, reflecting the corridor lighting back at itself. It was also empty, which was worse than it would have been if people were in it, because empty meant everyone had been moved somewhere specific, and the specific somewhere was a choice Victor had made. Grant and Evelyn moved along the wall. He checked each room as they passed empty, empty, empty. A conference room, with chairs pushed back from the table and 2 coffee cups still on the surface. Someone interrupted mid-meeting. At the end of the corridor, the executive conference suite occupied the building's northeast corner. Through the glass wall, Grant could see the room. Victor Sloan was inside. He was standing with his back partly to the door, facing the room's interior, a satellite phone pressed to his ear. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, the build of someone who'd kept himself in shape past the age when most people stopped bothering. No. Grant had seen him in the building, had moved out of his way in corridors the way maintenance staff learned to move out of the way of security directors, invisible and expected to stay that way. No. There were 2 armed men visible in the room, one near the door, one covering the room's interior. And in a chair near the window, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, was an older man in a board member's suit who Grant didn't know by face but whose posture even restrained. At whatever age he was carried the unmistakable uprightness of someone who'd spent decades commanding things. Warren Maddox looked across the conference room, through the glass wall, and directly at Grant Holloway. Grant pressed himself flat against the wall, to the left of the door. Evelyn was right behind him. "Too visible," he said, barely moving his mouth. "Probably one more I can't see from this angle." "Victor's on the phone." "Maddox is alive," she said. "For now. Victor needs him for something leverage, insurance. A clean way out if federal breach goes wrong." He looked at the door. Standard commercial hardware, card access handle, glass panel on the right side. The man near the door is watching the interior of the room, not the corridor. Victor's not expecting anyone to come at him from inside his own building's walls. "Because no one knows the building like you do," Evelyn said. "That's the assumption, yeah." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that he recognized not from this building, not from the last few hours, but from a long time ago. Expression of someone deciding that what was about to happen was necessary and accepting that fact. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Grant thought about it for 3 seconds. "There's a secondary access on the conference suite's west side," he said. "Service door. It's going to be locked, but my master key handles it. When I go through the main door, go through the service entry. The second armed man, wherever he's positioned, he'll be watching the main entry point. The service door will be his blind spot. And if Victor sees me first, he won't be able to do anything about it," Grant said, "because he'll be occupied." She looked at him steadily. "Get killed. I wasn't planning on it. I mean it," she said. It wasn't the kind of thing she said for reassurance. She said it the way people said things they meant and wanted acknowledged. He said, She held his gaze for one more second. Then she moved left toward the service corridor. That would bring her to the west entry. Grant Holloway looked at the conference room door. Through the glass, he could see Victor Sloan still on the phone, two armed men, Warren Maddox zip-tied to a chair. He could see the satellite uplink terminal on the conference table, its screen showing an active connection. He gave Evelyn 15 seconds to reach the service door. Then he put his master key in the conference room door, turned it, pushed it open, and walked in. The armed man near the door turned first. Fast trained, already moving. Hit him with everything had. Granat hit him with every sin of the maintenance corridors. Not the economy of force you needed to stay used when you needed to stay quiet, something older and harder. The full application of what happened when a man who had spent years being invisible decided to stop being invisible. The room became very loud and very fast and very real, and somewhere in it, Warren Maddox said something that Grant couldn't hear over the noise of what was happening. And through the service door on the west wall, Evelyn Carrington came in. The first man went down hard against the conference table, and the sound of its wooden body and the crash of a Colt laptop sliding to the floor was enormous in the glass-walled room. The second man was faster than Grant had expected. He came from the right, from the position Grant hadn't been able to see through the glass, which meant Grant had known he was there and accounted for the possibility, and was still half a second behind when the man's arm caught him across the upper chest and drove him into the credenza along the wall. Something on the credenza, a glass awards piece, heavy, the kind corporations gave each other to mark occasions, came down on Grant's shoulder and shattered on the floor. It hurt. He filed it away. The second man was trained, not just large, and he knew how to use his size advantage. He got Grant by the collar and drove him back again, and Grant let the momentum carry him, turned with it instead of against it, and used the man's own force to redirect him into the wall with enough controlled violence that the drywall cracked and the man's grip broke. Grant hit him twice, precisely in the places that ended a fight quickly, and the man went down and stayed down. He turned around. Victor Sloan had dropped the satellite phone. He was standing near the window, and he had a weapon out, not pointed yet, just in his hand, the particular posture of a man deciding how far he was willing to take this. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city spread out 44 floors below in the flat gray light of mid-morning. At the service door, on the west wall, Evelyn had come through. She'd stopped just inside the room, assessing it the same way Grant had fast, systematic, cataloging positions and threats and options. She wasn't looking at Victor. She was looking at Warren Maddox. Maddox was in his chair, zip ties still on, watching Grant with an expression that was harder to read than Grant had expected from a man in his situation. Relief, not gratitude. Something more complicated and more alert. "Who you are," Victor said. Grant turned to look at him. Victor's voice was steady, the voice of someone who had worked in controlled situations for a long time and knew how to manage himself when things went wrong. "Grant Holloway. 10 years of maintenance work, 3 of them here. Before that, Navy, SEAL. You were the team lead on the Crestfall operation." The name hit Grant like something physical. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. "Victor," Evelyn said, from across the room, her voice even, "put the weapon down." Victor didn't look at her. He kept looking at Grant. "You want to know something interesting? I knew your name before I knew hers. The Crestfall operation is the reason I know the people I know. The reason this," he glanced around the room, a brief, almost rueful gesture, "is even possible." Grant said nothing. "You blamed yourself," Victor said. "You did. The whole debrief, the inquiry, the report that got buried, you took it. Said your decisions, your call, your read on the intel. 2 men dead, and you accepted it like it was yours to accept." "It was my mission," Grant said. "The communications were burned before you ever stepped off that aircraft," Victor said. "That now, right? Because if Maddox has been talking," he glanced at the Admiral for the first time, a quick, cold look. "He's been talking." "Enough," Maddox said. His voice was the voice from the radio, old and measured, with nothing performative in it. "He knows enough." Victor looked back at Grant. The weapon was still in his hand, still not raised, and Grant was calculating the distance between them against his own shoulder, yet which was starting to inform him with some insistence about the credenza and the 2 men on the floor who were down but not indefinitely. The Halcyon network, Grant said. That's what connected them. The Crestfall Communications, and what's been running through Carrington's procurement channels. Something shifted in Victor's expression, just slightly. The particular adjustment of a man who had expected to control the information in a room and was recalibrating. You've been busy, Victor said. Maddox transmitted the name, Grant said. Open frequency. Whatever you thought you were containing, you lost it the moment he got to his signal. Victor looked at Maddox. The look lasted 2 seconds and carried the weight of something that had been building for longer than this morning. You were always the problem, Victor said to him. Maddox said without apology. Victor raised the weapon. Grant moved. The distance between them was 12 feet, and he covered it in the way that distance got covered, when there was no alternative, not fast enough to feel fast, but fast enough the shot went into the window frame instead of into Grant, the suppressed crack of it absorbed by the glass that spider-webbed from the impact point but held. They went into each other, and it was ugly, the way real physical conflict was always ugly, nothing clean about it. Victor was fit and trained, and had 20 years of field experience from whatever he'd been before he became a security director. And Grant's shoulder was screaming, and they fought across the width of the conference room with the broken glass from the awards piece and the bodies of the 2 men on the floor as obstacles. Victor got his arm around Grant's neck from behind. Proper technique, the right angle, the kind of hold that had an outcome, if you let it develop. Grant didn't let it develop. He dropped his weight, drove his elbow back, felt it connect, and when Victor's grip broke by a fraction, Grant turned inside it and got a hand on the weapon arm and applied force to the wrist in the direction the joint wasn't designed to travel. Victor made a sound. The weapon dropped. Grant put him into the conference table, face down, and held him there, with a forearm across his shoulders and his knee in the right position to make standing up a bad idea. Victor stopped moving. For a moment, the room was very still. The spider-webbed window held its fractured pattern against the gray city outside. The satellite terminal on the table beeped once, twice, maintaining its connection to wherever it was connected. Grant was breathing hard. His shoulder hurt seriously now, the kind of serious that was going to require attention, but not yet. Evelyn's voice. He looked up. She was at Maddox's chair, working at the zip ties with a letter opener she'd found on the credenza, her hands quick and methodical. Maddox sat still while she worked, watching Grant across the room, with that same complicated, alert expression. The Halcyon network, Grant said to Maddox. Tell me. Hold him first, Maddox said. Grant looked around. On the floor near the door, the equipment belt the first man had been wearing included, as Grant had hoped, zip restraints. He got them, secured Victor's wrists behind him with the same efficiency Victor's own people had used on Maddox, and then stepped back. Victor turned his head to the side against the table surface. He was breathing carefully, controlled. Even now, even like this, he had the manner of someone managing the situation, rather than losing it. This isn't finished, Victor said. It's finished enough, Grant said. He crossed the room and crouched in front of Maddox's chair. Evelyn had gotten the zip ties off his wrists. Both wrists were red and marked, and Maddox was flexing his hands, restoring circulation with the methodical attention of a man who understood his body's needs without fuss. He was older than Grant had expected. Late 70s, maybe, the kind of age that had compressed him slightly without reducing him. His eyes were clear and focused in a way that made Grant think of men he'd served under the particular quality of attention that came from decades of making decisions that mattered. Halcyon, Maddox said, is a procurement and intelligence brokerage network. It's been operating for approximately 14 years. It uses legitimate defense contractor channels companies like Carrington Aerospace as conduits for moving classified technology to buyers that the United States government would never officially sell to. He paused, looked at Evelyn. Your predecessor knew about it. Your father, Evelyn. Evelyn had gone completely still. He didn't run it, Maddox said. He wasn't a criminal. But he knew, and he looked away, because looking away was profitable and looking toward it would have been very dangerous. When he died, and you inherited the company, you were the unknown variable. You were the audit risk. Because I might actually look, Evelyn said. Because you did look, Maddox said. The audit you ordered 3 weeks ago. That's what triggered this. The room was quiet except for the beeping of the satellite terminal. Grant looked at it. The connection indicator showed an active link. Whoever Victor had been talking to when they'd come through the door was still on the other end, had heard everything, had probably already been initiating whatever contingency plan existed for this outcome. He crossed the room and pulled the satellite terminal's power connection from the wall. The beeping stopped. "The Crestfall operation," Grant said, turning back. He said it the same way. He said anything difficult flat, without inflection, because the inflection was the thing that would cost him. "You said Halcyon was involved in the communications compromise." Maddox met his eyes. "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because 14 years ago I was in a position to things I should have done more with than I did." The old man's voice didn't change. It stayed measured. But something behind it shifted the weight of a very specific kind of regret that didn't have a clean resolution. "I was aware that Halcyon had penetrated certain DoD communication networks. I reported it. The report was classified, delayed, reviewed by people who had reasons to delay it further." He stopped. "Crestfall was conducted on a communication network that I knew by the time of the operation had been compromised. I raised concerns through channels. The operation proceeded." Grant sat with that for a moment. 9 years. 9 years of a particular belief that 2 men had died. Decisions he'd made. Because of decisions, his read on the situation had been wrong. He'd been the team leader, and team leaders carried what happened to their teams. 9 years of Sophie's father being a man with a specific weight behind his eyes that never quite went away regardless of how many school lunches he made or bus stops he stood at. "You couldn't have stopped it," Maddox said. "The order to proceed came from 2 levels above anything you had access to. And the communications breach, even if you'd known, the pattern of failure was designed to look like environmental interference. Fog of war. Human error." He looked at Grant with the directness of someone who had decided that directness was the only thing left worth offering. "Daniel Reeves and Christopher Ortega were killed by a network that had penetrated your chain of command before your boots hit the ground. You gave an order based on intelligence that had been doctored before it reached you. There's no version of that night where different choices on your part change what happened." Grant didn't say anything. He stood at the window, the cracked one, the one that had taken a round that was meant for him, and he looked at the city below without really seeing it. 44 floors. The same air his elevator had fallen through 6 hours ago. Completely different man, standing in it now than the one who had come in this morning. Except he wasn't a different man at all. He was the same one, with the same face and the same hands, and the same daughter, who would be home from school at 3:15. He thought about Reeves. He tried not to because he'd spent 9 years trying not to, but he let himself for one moment. Reeves with his particular laugh and the photograph of his kids he'd kept in his gear, the way he'd always been the first one to know when something was wrong with the plan, even when he couldn't articulate exactly what. He thought about Ortega, who'd been 26 years old, who'd had a wife 7 months pregnant when they deployed. He'd spent 9 years believing he'd failed them. The belief didn't disappear. That wasn't how beliefs worked, especially not the ones you'd built a whole life around absorbing. But something shifted underneath it, the floor of it, the foundation, and the particular quality of the weight changed. Lighter, different. Grant. Evelyn's voice. Quiet. He turned around. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him in the elevator shaft, measuring, decising, and this time with something additional that he couldn't name cleanly, but that felt like recognition. Like she was seeing something she'd been looking at for hours, and was only now understanding what it was. "We need to deal with the room," she said. "And we're running out of window before federal response breaches." He came back to the present. The room. Victor on the floor, restrained, watching the ceiling with the expression of a man taking inventory of his remaining options. The 2 other men, one still out cold, one beginning to stir. Maddox in his chair, rubbing circulation back into his wrists. The dead satellite terminal. The cracked window with the city beyond it. "Can he walk?" Grant asked, meaning Maddox. "I can walk," Maddox said, with the mildly offended precision of a man who'd been walking for 70-something years and didn't require assessment. "Victor stays here," Grant said. He looked at them. The second man was starting to push himself up on one arm. Grant crossed the room helped him into a sitting position against the wall, not gently, but without unnecessary force, and used a second set of zip restraints from the equipment belt. Stay here too. He looked at Evelyn. The federal team is going to breach from the lobby. Victor will have men positioned, expecting that. We need to get word to whoever's leading the response about the building, lay out the passages, the maintenance infrastructure, the communications jam, and which frequency bands it's using. The emergency phone on 38, she said. Still the best option. Analog line. That's 6 floors down. There's a service stair off this corridor, northwest side. Different from the decommissioned one. He looked at her. It'll be in Victor's security plan, meaning his people will have it. Yes, she thought for a moment. How many does he have left in the building? Started with at least 8. We've accounted for 4. He looked at Victor. How many? Victor said nothing. Grant hadn't expected him to. 6 floors. Probably 2 of them watching the stairwells. If we move right and move quiet. I can help with the quiet, Maddox said. He'd stood up from his chair, straightened his jacket with the reflexive precision of a man for whom posture was habit rather than effort. Victor's operational patterns. I've worked with him before, in other contexts. He said it without emotion, as a fact that didn't require elaboration. The northwest stair, he'll have it covered at the 39th floor, landing, not the 44th. He'll want reaction time, not close coverage. Grant looked at him. How confident? Reasonably. That's not very confident. Maddox said, It's not, but it's what I have. Grant looked at Evelyn. She gave him the same look she'd been giving him since the elevator, you decide. But I'm with you, which wasn't quite accurate, because she'd been deciding plenty for herself. But it was what the look communicated, and he'd learned in the last few hours to read what she actually meant rather than the surface of what she said. Okay, he said. We go down. He checked on Victor one more time, restraints holding, positioned away from anything useful, and then he went to the conference room door and looked through the glass at the corridor outside. And clear. He opened the door. The 44th floor corridor was still carpeted and paneled and lit with the same corporate permanence as before, but it felt different now. Or he felt different in it. The invisible maintenance worker, the man nobody looked at twice, had walked into a conference room and put the building's security director on the floor, and somewhere in the process of the last 6 hours, the thing he'd been carrying had shifted enough that he wasn't entirely sure what shape it was anymore. He led them out into the corridor, Evelyn, then Maddox, Grant checking their back, and toward the northwest stair, 20 feet from the stair door when it opened. The man who came through it was alone, which was either good luck or a trap, and Grant was deciding which when the man looked up and saw them and went for his weapon. Grant was already moving. He'd had 20 feet of corridor and the half-second head start of seeing the door handle turn before it opened, which was enough. He hit the man before the weapon cleared the holster, took him down in the corridor with controlled and unglamorous efficiency elbow, weight, position, and the man went down on the carpet. He looked back at Evelyn and Maddox. They'd pressed to the wall, both of them, and Evelyn had done it correctly low, to the side of the corridor, minimizing profile, like she'd done it before, or like she'd processed enough of the last several hours to have learned the instinct. One, Grant said quietly. One visible, Maddox said, correcting him with the exactness of someone who'd counted operationally for most of his adult life. Visible, Grant agreed. He checked the stair. Clear in both directions. Maddox had been right about the positioning. The coverage was at 39, not 44, which gave them 4 floors of clear stairwell before they had to worry about it. They moved. In the stairwell, going down, the building felt different than it had coming up. Quieter, if anything. Grant's awareness of every sound was sharper, his shoulder continuing its insistent commentary, his body running on reserves he'd been drawing from since 10:47 that morning. The specific shape of the tension had changed. They were going toward something now rather than improvising away from danger. And that change in direction affected everything: the quality of the silence between footsteps, the way Maddox moved steadily without complaint, with the compact economy of a man who'd done field work in his own past. The way Evelyn's hand trailed the stair, railing without quite touching it, keeping balance without committing weight. They stopped at 39. Grant listened through the door for 20 seconds. He could hear them, two men, positioned on either side of the stair, landing beyond the door. The small shuffling sounds of people standing still and trying not to. He looked at the door, then at the ceiling, then at the wall. There's a utility space access on this landing, he said, barely above a whisper. Behind that panel. He pointed to what looked like a painted-over maintenance hatch in the wall. It connects to the horizontal chase that runs between floors 38 and 39. If we go through it, we bypass this landing entirely and come out in the ceiling space above 38. Maddox looked at the panel. That space is on the building schematics? Grant said. The old man nodded once, as if that settled something. Then go. The panel required a specific touch, not a key, just knowledge of the release point, which Grant had in his hands, the way he had every other hidden mechanism in this building. It came open without sound. They went through. The utility space was lower than the ceiling plenum they'd traversed. Earlier, this was the interstitial between floors, just barely enough clearance to move through on hands and knees. Tight, dark, smelling of the building's thermal mass. Grant went first with his phone's screen providing minimal light, enough to see the path without being enough to project through gaps. Evelyn followed without being asked. Maddox, to his credit, followed without comment on the conditions which Grant had half expected might be a problem. Instead, the Admiral moved through the interstitial space with the practical determination of a man who had decided that dignity could wait. They came out through a floor access panel into a mechanical room on 38, 20 feet from the emergency phone. Grant went to it, lifted the handset. Dial tone. He dialed the single number he'd been given in basic training as the one you called when everything else was gone, a federal emergency coordination line that would, in theory, route to whoever was managing an active response in your area. 3 rings, professional, controlled, federal coordination. This is Grant Holloway, Carrington Aerospace Building, Seattle. I'm with Evelyn Carrington and retired Admiral Warren Maddox. We're on the 38th floor. You have a response team staging outside this building. A brief pause. We have you on record, Mr. Holloway. Miss Carrington made contact approximately 40 minutes ago. We have teams at the perimeter. What's your status? Primary threat is contained on 44. Victor Sloan, Building Security Director, restrained, Conference Suite, northeast corner. 3 additional operatives restrained in the same location. Building communications jam is being generated from a device on the 43rd floor mechanical room east wall, junction panel B14. Take that out first, and you restore building comms before you breach. A longer pause. He could hear the coordination happening on the other end, voices, keystrokes, or kinds of chaos of a response team getting updated information. Understood. Additional threats? Minimum 2 mobile in the building. Northwest stair on 39, last confirmed. There's a secondary device in the basement utility corridor ventilation junction B7. It's not armed to detonate, but it's live. Don't touch it without EOD. Copy, Mr. Holloway. Can you hold position? Grant looked at Evelyn. At Maddox. At the room they were in, concrete and servers, and the smell of electronics, and the residual dust from a ceiling space they'd just crawled through. We can hold position, he said. Sit tight, we're moving. He hung up. The mechanical room was quiet. The servers hummed. Somewhere below them, the building continued to function with the indifferent persistence of systems that didn't care what was happening in the human spaces between them, the elevators, and HVAC, and power routing running their cycles, without any awareness of the morning they'd all just had. Evelyn sat down on the floor with her back against a server rack. A collapse, a deliberate choice. The choice of someone who was allowing themselves to stop for the first time in hours. Because stopping was now briefly permitted. She pulled off the intact heel, looked at it, and set it on the floor beside her. Then she looked at the broken one still on her other foot and took that off too. She sat there in her blazer and her stocking feet on a concrete floor surrounded by servers, and she looked at Grant, who was standing with his back to the wall and his arms crossed, his shoulder, informing him at regular intervals of its continued existence. You called it in before we even got to the phone, she said. The communications jam, the device location, the floor positions. You had that organized in your head the whole time. Yeah. He stopped. It's just pattern recognition. It's not just pattern recognition, she said. He let that sit. Maddox had found a metal equipment case to sit on, which he'd done without ceremony. He looked at Grant across the room. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry. For what you carried. I'm sorry I didn't do more with what I knew when it could have mattered." Grant looked at him. The apology was real. He could hear that not performance, not the reflexive sorry of someone managing a conversation, but the kind that came from years of sitting with a specific thing and understanding its weight. The Admiral had his own version of what Grant had been carrying, Grant realized. Different shape, different origin, but the same fundamental quality of a thing you couldn't put down and couldn't fully carry. "It doesn't fix anything," Grant said. "No," Maddox said. "It doesn't." "But I hear you," Grant said. He looked at the wall. The servers hummed. Reeves had 3 kids. Grant said, "To the wall. To the room. Be specific." Ortega's son was born 6 weeks after the mission. He met him. Nobody said anything. There wasn't anything to say that would matter. But something in the saying of it, just putting it in the air of a room where 2 other people could hear it, did something small and real that 9 years of silence hadn't done. He wasn't sure yet what to call it. Above them, somewhere on the 43rd floor, the communications jamming device went offline. The silence of it was immediate and total, and then, as if the building exhaled, sounds returned to radio somewhere in the stairwell, a burst of coordinated communication, the organized movement of people who knew what they were doing, entering a structure that had been, until 60 seconds ago, opaque to them. Federal response had breached. Grant pushed off the wall and crossed to the mechanical room door. He opened it, looked into the corridor, and raised both hands old training, non-threatening posture, visible hands as the first 2 agents came around the corner with weapons raised, and the focused expressions of people who had been briefed on a lot of things that might not have captured the full picture. "Holloway," he said. I called in. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s, body armor, the kind of composed authority that came from doing this for real and not on a drill, looked at him, looked at his hands, looked at the maintenance uniform and the company ID and the shoulder that was visibly not having a good time. "The maintenance worker," she said. "Yeah," Grant said. She lowered her weapon by about 15 degrees. "We've got Sloan. Conference Suite 44, as described. Your information was accurate. You need medical?" "Probably," he said. She looked past him into the room. At Evelyn Carrington, sitting on the floor in her stocking feet. At Warren Maddox on his equipment case, 80-something years old, and straight-backed as a flagpole. "Is there anyone else in this building you want to tell me about before I put my team through it?" she asked. Grant thought about it seriously, which she seemed to appreciate. He walked her through everything, every position, every device, every maintenance corridor, and hidden access that Victor's team wouldn't have had on their maps. It took 6 minutes. She listened without interrupting, asked 2 clarifying questions, and relayed the information in real time to whoever was on her earpiece. When he was done, she looked at him for a moment. "How do you know this building that well?" she asked. Grant thought about 3 years of early mornings and late evenings, about the months of Chake retrofits and the fiber conduit work and the water main repairs, about the access panels he'd found that nobody had filed paperwork for, the corridors that existed in the building's actual structure but not in any of its official documents, about the specific satisfaction of knowing, without doubt, how something worked and what held it together, and where all the hidden places were. "It's my jumps," he said. She accepted that and turned back to her radio, and the building began the long process of becoming safe again, one corridor at a time. Grant walked back into the mechanical room and sat down on the floor near the door, his back against the 2-call, his legs straight in front of him. His shoulder was doing something specific and unpleasant that he was going to have to deal with. His hands were steady. He was aware of both facts with equal clarity. Evelyn looked at him from her position against the server rack. "No, it's over," she said. "Most of it," he said. She understood what he meant. The federal response, the arrest, the secured building, that part was over. The investigation, the network, the full accounting of what Halcyon was and what it had touched, that was years of work, and it was beginning, not ending. And the other thing, the thing he was sitting with in the particular quiet of a concrete room full of servers, with 2 people who'd been through the last 6 hours alongside him. That wasn't over either. That was something he was going to have to take home, and then he'd been living with it, and he had no clear picture yet of what that looked like. Sophie gets home at 3:15, he said. Evelyn looked at her watch. It's 12:40. I know. She looked at him for a moment. Will you make it? He thought about it seriously, the same way he thought about building layouts and positions and exit routes. He said, I'll make it. She nodded. Then she leaned her head back against the server rack and closed her eyes. And for the first time in 6 hours, she looked like someone who was allowing herself to be in a body that had been through something, rather than someone managing that fact from a careful distance. Maddox had produced a handkerchief from his jacket pocket, the actual fabric kind that nobody carried anymore, and was using it to clean his wrists where the zip ties had marked him. He caught Grant's eye across the room and gave him the small, undemonstrative nod of one military man to another, which contained more than the gesture suggested, and both of them knew it. Outside the mechanical room door, the building was returning to itself. Voices in corridors, radio communication, the organized sounds of a situation being processed and contained by people whose job it was to process and contain situations. Grant sat with his back against the wall and let himself be still. For a moment, just a moment, before whatever came next required him to move, required him again. He thought about Reeves. He thought about Ortega. He thought about Sophie's shoes in the hallway, and the note on the counter, and the bus at 7:40, and the strange fact that all of those things existed in the same man, in the same body, on the same ordinary Tuesday that turned out to be anything but. The servers hummed. The federal response moved through the building above them. Evelyn breathed steadily with her eyes closed. Grant Holloway sat in the mechanical room of the building, knew better than anyone. And for the first time in 9 years, the thing he'd been carrying felt like it might have a different shape on the other side of today. He didn't know yet what to do with that. But for the first time in a long time, he thought he might want to find out. They kept Grant in the building for another 2 hours. Victor's people. Victor was in federal custody before the clock hit 1 in the afternoon. Walked out of the 44th floor conference suite with his wrists restrained behind him, and the particular careful blankness of a man who had already decided that everything he said from this point forward would be said to lawyers. The agents who arrested him were professional about it, which Grant noticed. Theater, no speeches. Just the mechanics of containment applied efficiently to a man who had built his professional life around those same mechanics, and now found himself on the receiving end of them. What kept Grant in the building was the debrief. The federal response team needed his knowledge of the building's infrastructure, the unofficial passages, the hidden access panels, the communications jam device on 43, and the secondary device in the basement. That EOD had to be walked through carefully because Grant was the one who'd looked at it longest and knew how it was configured. He sat in a cleared conference room on the 22nd floor with a female named Parsons, and a male agent named Delgado, and a recording device on the table between them. Yes, he'd intervened every minute of the morning with the methodical accuracy of a man who had been trained to remember operational details under stress. His shoulder was looked at by a paramedic during a break. 2 ribs probably, though the paramedic was careful to say possibly bruised or cracked, not broken through, and the shoulder itself was soft tissue damage from the credenza rather than structural. He was told to go to the emergency room. He told the paramedic he would. He meant it, mostly. Evelyn was in a separate room doing her own debrief. He could see her through the glass partition once. When they moved him between rooms, she was at a conference table, with more agents than he'd been given, a laptop open in front of her, her blazer off and her sleeves rolled up. Talking intervened, talking with her hands in the way people talked when they were getting to specifics they'd been thinking about for hours. She didn't see him. Maddox was somewhere else in the building, which Grant didn't know and didn't try to find out. The Admiral had his own accounting, to make his own version of what he'd known and when and what he'd done with it, and that was between him and whatever inquiry followed. Grant had said his piece about the Crestfall operation to Parsons, who had written it all down with an expression that told him it was not entirely new information to federal investigators, that the thread they were following had been touching this particular part of the past for longer than Grant knew, was something to process later. At 2:47, Parsons closed her notepad, and told Grant he was free to go. She said it the way federal agents said things, factual, neither warm nor cold, leaving no ambiguity about what it meant. She also said that he should expect follow-up contact, that his testimony about the building infrastructure and the events of the morning would be material to a federal investigation, and that he should not leave the state without notifying the case number she gave him on a card. He took the card. He put on his jacket, which someone had retrieved from the 23rd floor utility chase, where he'd left it 6 hours earlier. He walked to the elevator, not the executive elevator, which was still sealed as evidence, its shaft marked with tape and the attention of people with clipboards, and rode down to the lobby. The lobby was full of people. Law enforcement, building staff who'd been evacuated and were being processed back in, a news presence outside the glass doors that he could see without being seen because the exterior cameras were still being managed by the response team. It smelled like coffee from somewhere. Someone had set up a staging area near the security desk with a folding table and 2 large cafes, and the specific organized chaos of an aftermath. People who had been doing urgent things now doing documentation things, which was less dramatic but arguably more important. Grant walked through it. Nobody stopped him. Nobody looked at him twice, which was so familiar that it almost made him laugh. Yes, he'd intervened. He went through the building's side service entrance, the one that maintenance staff used because it opened directly to the parking structure and avoided the lobby pedestrian flow. He walked to his car, a 7-year-old Civic with a cracked dashboard and a Sophie-sized backpack and a Z-size pet in the rear seat from a school trip 3 weeks ago that he kept forgetting to bring inside. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting it. His hands were on the steering wheel. They weren't shaking. That surprised him slightly, and then it didn't, because his hands hadn't shaken during any of it, and the body was consistent that way. It either held or it didn't, and his had held, the same way it always had, when it needed to, and it was only afterward, in the quiet, that the holding caught up with you. He started the car. He checked the time, 3:04. He made it to the bus stop with 8 minutes to spare. He was still in his work clothes, which were not in good shape. There was a tear in the left knee of his pants from the elevator shaft. The jacket had a stain on the right side that he didn't want to look at too carefully. He'd washed his hands in the building bathroom, before leaving, but the knuckles still had the particular quality of knuckles that had been used for something today. The bus stop was on Clement Street, half a block from the school, under a silver maple that was doing its late summer thing of dropping seeds onto the sidewalk in slow spiraling descents. 2 other parents were there, a woman he recognized from pickup last spring, and a man he'd seen a few times, never spoken to. Both of them glanced at him, the way people glanced at someone whose appearance didn't quite match the context, and then looked away, because this was the bus stop, and you didn't interrogate people at the bus stop about what had happened to their pants. The bus came at 3:13, which was early, which was unusual. Sophie came off the bus in the middle of the pack, the way she always did, not first, not last, in the organized chaos of children who had been sitting for 6 hours and were now released into the world. She had her backpack on both shoulders, and her hair was in the same ponytail it had been in that morning, except that about 40% of it had escaped, which was also standard. She was carrying something in one hand, a piece of construction paper, folded, the kind that came home from art class. She saw him, and her face did the thing it always did, which was the best thing Grant knew about being alive. She ran the last 20 feet. He crouched down to her level, and she hit him hard enough that he had to absorb it with his knees, and his shoulder registered the impact with pointed commentary that he ignored completely. She pressed her face into his jacket. "You smell weird. Bad day at work." She pulled back and looked at him with the forensic attention of an 8-year-old who had learned to read her father the same way he'd learned to read buildings, by paying attention to the things other people walked past. "Did you get hurt?" she asked. She was looking at his jacket, specifically at the tear near the pocket. "A little bit," he said. "Nothing serious. I'm okay." She studied him for another 2 seconds. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She accepted this with the particular trust of a child who had been told the truth consistently enough to believe it when it mattered. She held up the construction paper. "I made something. Let me see." She unfolded it. It was a drawing, crayon and marker, The ambitious kind that 8-year-olds produced with complete commitment to their vision even when the technical execution was abstract. It showed two figures, one large and one small, standing near something blue that was either water or sky. The large figure had brown hair and was holding the small figure's hand. Above them, in careful capital letters that had taken real effort, she had written, "My dad and me." Grant looked at it for a moment. "That's really good, Soph," he said. Mrs. Patterson said, "We should draw someone important," she said with the casual completeness of someone who had made an obvious choice. He folded the picture carefully, the right way, along its original creases, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he stood up, took her hand, and they walked toward home. She talked about school something, about a project on ocean ecosystems that she was very invested in, and a disagreement with a girl named Madison about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs, and the general injustice of the fact that art class had been cut short because of an assembly. He listened to all of it, the way he always listened, with his full attention, because she was 8 years old, and these were the things that mattered to her, and the things that mattered to her mattered to him. His shoulder hurt. His ribs were doing something unpleasant when he breathed too deep. He was going to have to call the emergency room and then tell Sophie something about it in a way that was true but not frightening. And he was going to have to figure out what to say to his supervisor about the day, and at some point, days or weeks from now, there would be testimony, nestimony, and investigation, and all the bureaucratic machinery of accountability that came after something like this. All of that was later. Right now, Sophie was telling him that dolphins could definitely recognize themselves in mirrors, and that this was basically proof they were at least as smart as dogs, possibly smarter. She wanted to know if they could get a book about it from the library this weekend. "Sure," he said. "We can do that." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. They walked the rest of the way home. The weeks that followed moved with the specific rhythm of aftermath, not dramatic, mostly paperwork and phone calls, and the incremental machinery of a federal investigation working through its process. Grant went to the emergency room that evening, confirmed 2 cracked ribs and a soft tissue shoulder injury. No, was given a brace, an ice pack recommendation, and a prescription he mostly didn't fill. He told Sophie he'd hurt himself at work. She took this seriously, made him a get-well card with a drawing of him sleeping under a blanket, and extracted a promise that he would wear the brace. He wore the brace. He was called back to give testimony twice. Both times he went, told the truth, answered every question with the same methodical accuracy he'd brought to the conference room with Parsons, and came home in time for dinner. Sophie asked both times if the meetings went okay. He told us. They did. His supervisor at building maintenance, a man named George, who had managed the department for 11 years and maintained a consistent policy of not being surprised by anything, had been remarkably straightforward about it. "You saved the owner of the company," George had said, on Grant's first day back, with the tone of a man reviewing a situation that had no obvious precedent in his management training. "Yeah," Grant said. George looked at him for a moment. "You good?" "Yeah," Grant said. George nodded. "All right then." And that had more or less been the extent of it, because George was that kind of person, and Grant appreciated him for it. The Halcyon investigation was federal and far-reaching and moved at the speed that complex, multi-jurisdictional financial crimes investigations moved, which was not fast. Victor Sloan was indicted within 30 days on charges that ran to 4 pages and included things Grant understood and things he didn't, and things that had names he'd never heard but that clearly represented serious weight. The criminal network itself, the procurement channels, the shell companies, the technology routing, would take years to fully unwind. But it was unwinding. Evelyn called him, 12 days after the building, on his cell phone. He was making dinner when it rang pasta, because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were pasta in the Holloway household, which had been true for 2 years because Sophie had decided at age 6 that it was a rule, and Grant had never found a good reason to argue. He saw her name on the screen and stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the wooden spoon in his hand, and then he answered. "Holloway," she said. "Yeah. How's the shoulder?" "The ribs are still being difficult." "Ribs take time," she said. "That's what they tell me." A brief pause. Not uncomfortable, just the pause of two people who had been through something together and were navigating what version of themselves they were to each other in ordinary life. I wanted to tell you something, she said. The records from the server isolation. The 60% we preserved, investigators say it's enough. The shell company routing, the technology transfers, the internal approvals. It's enough to build the full picture. He exhaled. There's also, she paused, the Crestfall file. The communications compromise investigation that Maddox had flagged through official channels 9 years ago, and that got buried. It's been unburied. The D-Inquiry is going to look at it formally, as part of the Halcyon Network's history. Grant was quiet for a moment. That means Reeves and Ortega's records, he said. Yes, she said. Their service records will be corrected. Their families will know what actually happened. She said it simply, without dressing it up, which was the right way to say it. I thought you should hear that, from someone who was there. He stood in his kitchen with the wooden spoon and the pasta at a rolling boil and Sophie's backpack on the chair where she always left it, and he sat with that for a moment the way you sat, with something that was not good news exactly, because nothing about it was good. Not at the root, but was the right thing. The true thing, thank you, he said. Yeah, she said. Their pause. There's something else, she said. And you can say no. Okay. I want to offer you chief of security for the company. Full executive position. You'd have the budget, the authority, the team. Everything you'd need to rebuild what Victor was supposed to be doing. And wasn't. She stopped. You're better qualified than anyone I could hire. And you know this company from its inside in ways that no outside candidate ever would. Grant looked at the pasta. It needed to be turned down to simmer. He said, silence for a beat. Okay, she said. Argument, no pressure. He'd half expected at least some push. But she was who she was, and she'd spent the last 12 days learning something about what he was. And she'd made the offer, knowing the answer was possible. I appreciate it, he said. I mean that. But Sophie doesn't need me to be the chief of security of a defense contractor. She needs me to be at the bus stop. I know, Evelyn said. I thought I should offer anyway. Yeah, he said. He turned the pasta down. To simmer. He heard Sophie in her room, the sound of something being moved, the shoebox of erasers, probably. Reorganized, for reasons that made complete sense to an 8-year-old. There might be another way to use what you know, Evelyn said, slowly. Something that doesn't require you to be on call at all hours, or run a department, or be away from home. I'm listening, he said. She told him about it. 3 days a week. Building systems integration with security infrastructure, the kind of institutional knowledge that companies like Carrington Aerospace have for expensive consultants to fake and never quite got right, because the consultants didn't actually know how the building worked. He'd be a resource, not a manager. He could structure his hours around Sophie's school schedule. The pay would be substantially different from Truden's wages, which she named. And he didn't say anything for a moment because the number was more than he'd made in a year. Weekends, he said. Completely off. And if there's ever a conflict with something involving Sophie, Sophie wins. Without discussion. He thought about it for 10 seconds. Genuinely considered it. The way he considered building layouts, looking for the problems, the hidden structural issues, the things that seemed fine until they weren't. It seemed fine, actually fine. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He heard the smile in it. Not the CEO, smiled the other one. The one he'd seen in the elevator when she was pressed against the wall with her palm bleeding, and she'd asked him, what do we do, with the same directness she brought to everything? I'll have someone send over the paperwork, she said. Have someone send it to my work email. You still have a work email at maintenance? George hasn't changed it. Of course he hasn't, she said. He'd intervened. They talked for another few minutes, nothing urgent, just the easy conversation of two people finding out what the shape of their relationship was going to be, in a context where nobody was trying to kill anyone. She asked about Sophie. He told her about the dolphin dispute and the ocean ecosystems project. She said she'd spent 2 days after the building incident learning more about shell company structures than she'd ever wanted to know, which was a different kind of project, but with the similar obsessive quality. He laughed. It surprised him slightly. I'll see you when the paperwork comes through, she said. He said. And Evelyn. Yeah, thank you. For not just accepting what Victor had set up. For ordering the audit in the first place. He paused. A lot of people in your position would have looked away. She was quiet for a moment. My father looked away, she said. He probably had his reasons. I'm sure they made sense to him. A brief silence. I didn't want to be someone who had their reasons. He understood that entirely. Good night, Holloway, she said. Good night, he said. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in his hand and the pasta simmering and the early evening light coming through the window over the sink, the Seattle light that was particular to August, still bright, but with something autumnal beginning to gather behind it. The suggestion of a season turning. Dad, Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her socks. Is pasta almost ready? 5 minutes, he said. Who were you talking to? Someone from work. She processed this. The person you saved? He looked at her. Who told you I saved someone? She shrugged with the elaborate casualness of an 8-year-old concealing a source. Mrs. Patterson heard it on the news. She told me. She looked at him with her mother's dark eyes. Is it true? Grant turned back to the pasta. He stirred it. I helped someone, he said. It was a team effort. Sophie came into the kitchen and climbed onto the counter stool, the one she'd claimed as hers 2 years ago, and that he'd stopped arguing about. She watched him stir the pasta. Were you scared? She asked. He thought about the elevator shaft, the cable roaring past him. Victor's weapon going into the window frame 6 inches from his head. Moment in the ceiling space above the 38th floor when he'd told a billionaire about 2 men named Reeves and Ortega and heard his own voice say their names in a room where someone was listening. He said, for a minute, but you still did it. Sut. Yeah. Sophie nodded slowly in the way she nodded when she was thinking something through and arriving at a conclusion she found satisfying. That's what brave is, she said. Mrs. Patterson said brave isn't not being scared. It's doing it even when you are. Grant looked at his daughter, 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and her gap-toothed smile and her box of animal erasers and her absolute conviction about the intelligence of dolphins, sitting on a kitchen stool in her socks, telling him something he'd spent 9 years trying to understand. Yeah, he said. That's right. Okay, she said, with the brisk finality of someone who had established a point to her satisfaction. Is there garlic bread? There is garlic bread. Good. She reached across the counter and picked up a pencil she'd left there earlier. She was always leaving pencils in unlikely places, and went back to whatever she'd been working on. At the counter's far end, a drawing that he could see was ocean-related, probably research for the ecosystem project. He put the garlic bread in the oven. He finished the pasta. He set the table 2 plates, 2 glasses of water, the particular configuration of a meal, for 2 people that was complete unto itself and had been for 5 years and was going to be okay. They ate dinner. Sophie told him 3 additional facts about dolphin cognition that she had apparently been saving for the meal, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone presenting evidence in a case she fully expected to win. He listened to all of it and asked 2 questions that she found satisfying, and one that she said was actually a really good one, which he accepted as high praise. After dinner, she helped him clear the table in the way she helped bringing her own plate and glass to the sink, and then beginning a project she'd thought of while doing it, to note to be, which tonight was sketching a rough blueprint of what she described as an underwater research station on a piece of notebook paper. He washed the dishes. The kitchen settled into the comfortable quiet of an evening with no particular agenda. The sound of pencil on paper and running water and the building making its building sounds. He thought briefly and without forcing it about Daniel Reeves, Christopher Ortega, about the families who were going to receive. In the coming weeks, correction director told them one thing for 9 years and would now tell them the truth, if that was better. He suspected it was, in the way that true things were generally better than false ones, even when the truth was difficult. He hoped the families thought so. He was going to carry not knowing for a while longer. He dried the last dish and hung the dish towel on the oven handle. Sophie had fallen asleep at the counter. She did this sometimes just went under, mid-project, the way children did when their bodies simply decided that the day was over. She was leaning on her folded arms, her pencil still loosely. In one hand, the underwater research station blueprint, half finished in front of her. Her hair had fully escaped the ponytail. Grant stood and looked at her for a moment. Yes, he'd intervened. Then he picked her up carefully. his shoulder reporting in, which he managed by distributing the weight and not thinking too hard about it, and carried her to her room. He stirred slightly when he laid her down, enough to say something that wasn't quite a word, and then went back under. He pulled the blanket up. He picked up the shoes from the hallway outside her door and lined them up, toes toward the wall. He went back to the kitchen and turned off the light. He stood at the window over the sink for a moment, looking out at the street. The silver maple at the bus stop was visible from here, half a block away, its seeds still coming down in the particular slow spiral of late summer. The street was quiet, ordinary. The specific ordinary of a neighborhood that had no idea what kind of day the man at the window had just had, and didn't need to, and that was fine. He thought about the morning, the alarm at 5:15, on the counter, the grease on his hands, and the elevator shaft, and the cable roaring past him in the dark. He thought about Evelyn's hand, taking his in the maintenance shaft access, functional and unsentimental. He thought about Maddox in the decommissioned stairwell, telling him in the measured voice of a man delivering a verdict 9 years overdue that the choices he'd made on a compromised mission had not killed his teammates. He thought about what Evelyn had said in the ceiling space, above the floor, where people were looking for them. "You've been ready. The whole time you've been here, you've been ready." He'd thought, when she said it, that she was wrong. The man who climbed elevator shafts and disarmed brake circuits was a different man from the one who made lunch and stood at bus stops. That the thing he'd done that morning was something he'd kept separate from his actual life, contained and boxed away, only to be accessed in extremity. Standing at the window, he understood that she'd been right. He hadn't been two different men. He'd been one man carrying two things that he'd believed couldn't coexist, and he'd organized his entire understanding of himself around keeping them apart. The SEAL who had failed his teammates, and the father who would not fail his daughter. Two versions, neither complete, neither sufficient. He was tired of maintaining the separation. Not tired in the way that led to giving up. Tired in the way that led to putting something down that you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten. It had weight, the specific exhaustion of a man who had been holding his breath for 9 years and was finally, cautiously, beginning to breathe. It was going to be strange. Whatever came next, the new work arrangement and the federal testimony that wasn't finished yet and the correction to Reeves and Ortega's records that he was going to have to figure out how to receive. Evelyn, and what the shape of that was not yet defined, not yet named, something that existed in the space between she saved the server records and he kept her alive. And whatever came after that in ordinary daylight. Sophie, who had told him with complete confidence that Brave was doing it even when you were scared, who was asleep in her room, and who was currently unfinished blueprint of an underwater research station and a box of animal erasers and everything she needed, including a father who was going to be at the bus stop tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that. He was going to be okay. Not because anything had been fixed or resolved in some clean way that made the past smaller than it was. Because the thing he'd believed about himself, the specific belief that had shaped 9 years of how he moved through the world, had cracked, and cracks in load-bearing beliefs changed what you could carry and how. He was going to be okay, and the okay was going to be the real kind, which was the hard kind, which was the only kind worth having. Grant Holloway turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He slept better than he had in years. The official correction to Daniel Reeves, Christopher Ortega's service records, came through on a Thursday morning in late October, which was an ordinary Thursday in every other respect. Grant was in the middle of his second cup of coffee when his phone buzzed with an email from a DO'd case officer whose name he'd memorized from the testimony process, and the subject line said, Crestfall Operation Official Record Correction Final. He sat with the phone for a long time. The email was bureaucratic, in the way that all official communications were bureaucratic, careful language, precise dates, the particular grammar of institutions acknowledging things they would have preferred to leave alone. But underneath the careful language was the thing that mattered. The record now stated, formally and permanently, that the Crestfall operation had been conducted on the basis of deliberately compromised intelligence, that the communications breach had occurred upstream of the operational team, and that the decisions made by the team leader Grant's name, his rank, His service number had been based on falsified information and could not be considered contributory to the outcome. Could not be considered contributory to the outcome. Words. He read them 4 times. They didn't make Reeves alive again. They didn't give Ortega's son a father who came home. They didn't undo a single thing that had happened in a part of the world Grant still couldn't name in an official context. What they did was take the specific weight of a specific lie, the lie he'd told himself for 9 years, that it had been his fault, that different choices would have changed it and put it somewhere outside him. Made it a matter of record, rather than a matter of private self-conviction. He called the number for Reeves's widow he'd been given it by the case officer, who'd asked if he wanted it and left the choice entirely to him. He'd taken it without knowing if he'd use it. She answered on the second ring. Her name was Carol. She sounded like a woman in her mid-40s who had been managing things for a long time and had gotten good at it without particularly wanting to. "I don't know if this helps," he said, after he'd told her who he was. "I wanted you to hear it from someone who was there. Daniel, he made the right calls that night. Everything he did was right. The situation we were in was wrong before we walked into it, and that wasn't on him and it wasn't on me, and I'm sorry it took 9 years for anyone to say that officially." Carol was quiet for a moment. "He talked about you," she said. "Often, but sometimes." Grant didn't know what to say to that. "He said you were the kind of leader who remembered your people." "We're people," she said. "Just assets, not just parts of the mission." A pause. "I think he would have wanted you to know that he didn't blame you. Even then, he wouldn't have." Grant sat in his kitchen, in the chair where Sophie ate breakfast, and he pressed his free hand flat on the table surface and looked at it and breathed. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for calling," Carol said. "I mean that." He called Ortega's family next a different number, his mother, because the wife had remarried 3 years after, and the case officer had given him options. Maria Ortega was 71 years old and spoke with the particular cadence of someone whose first language lived just under the surface of her English. She cried quietly while he talked, and when she stopped she said, "Christopher always said the men he served with were the best men he knew. I think he was right." After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen for a while, paralyzed, not collapsed into anything. Just sitting with the specific quality of a thing that had been set down the moment after you put something heavy on the ground and your hands are empty and your body is recalibrating to the absence of that weight. It didn't feel like relief exactly. It felt more like the first breath of air after you've been somewhere where the air was wrong for a very long time. Sophie found him there when she came downstairs for breakfast. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since the building with extra attention, tuned to some frequency she'd set to monitor him without being able to name. "Why?" "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I got some news this morning." "Good news or bad news?" He thought about how to answer that. "The kind that's both at the same time," he said. "You know how sometimes something is sad and right at the same time?" She considered this with genuine seriousness, stirring her cereal. "Like when we had to give the stray cat to Mrs. Patterson. Because you're allergic, but then we knew Mrs. Patterson was lonely?" "Exactly like that," he said. She nodded, satisfied that she understood, and went back to her cereal. He made her lunch. He wrote the note. He stood at the bus stop and watched the bus come and carry her away, and then he drove to work. The new arrangement at Carrington Aerospace had been in place for 6 weeks by then, and it had settled into a shape that was, Grant thought, genuinely workable, which was more than he'd allowed himself to expect when he'd agreed to it. 3 days a week, Tuesday through Thursday, in a small office on the 18th floor that had a window and a standing desk and a whiteboard he'd covered with building system diagrams that the security team used as reference material. Yes, he'd intervened. He worked with the building engineers on integrating the physical infrastructure with the security architecture, which was exactly the kind of work that nobody had been doing properly because nobody had understood both sides of it. No, well enough to do it. He was good at it. He'd always been good at it. He just hadn't had a context before where that particular skill set had a legitimate home. Evelyn stopped by his office on Tuesdays sometimes. Always she had an entire company to rebuild under the dual pressures of a federal investigation and an aerospace industry that was watching to see how Carrington handled the fallout. But sometimes she appeared in the doorway with coffee she'd gotten herself from the machine down the hall because she'd learned that the executive floor's espresso setup was available and had decided she preferred the machine down the hall for reasons she'd explained once, and that Grant had not fully followed but had accepted as consistent with her character. She'd bring 2 cups. She'd sit in the chair across from his desk, the one he'd brought from a supply room, because the office hadn't come with a visitor chair. They'd talk about work, or about the investigation's progress, or about nothing in particular in the way that 2 people talked when they were finding out what ordinary felt like between them. It was slow. That was the right word for it. They were both people who had learned, in different ways and for different reasons, to be careful about what they trusted, and slow was not a flaw in the process, it was the process. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't think she was either. One Tuesday in November, she came by later than usual, and she had the look she sometimes had after a meeting with the federal investigation team, a specific exhaustion that was different from the ordinary kind. The exhaustion of someone who had been asked to relive accurate and unpleasant things in precise detail for the 7th time. She set his coffee on the desk and sat down and said nothing for a moment, which she was comfortable enough with him now to do. "Long day?" he asked. "They found another shell company," she said. "The 3rd tier of the routing structure, which means the network was larger than the initial estimate." She looked at her coffee cup. "My father knew about some of this, more than I wanted it to be," he said. She looked at him. "Does it change what you think about him?" Grant considered the question honestly, which she always seemed to want from him more than reassurances. "I think he was a person who made choices that were wrong, and probably told himself reasons they weren't," he said. "I think most people who look away from bad things believe they're doing it for good reasons." He paused. It doesn't make him a good man for those choices. It also doesn't make him only those choices." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's a more generous reading than I've been able to get to," she said. "You're his daughter," Grant said. "You're allowed to take longer." She looked at him with the expression he'd come to know, the one that was slightly surprised by him. Still, even after months. She kept expecting him to be simpler than he was. "How do you do that?" she said. "Do what?" "See things clearly without making them smaller than they are." He thought about it. "I spent 9 years making something larger than it was," he said. "Overcorrecting, probably." She almost smiled. He'd come to appreciate almost. She didn't give the full version easily, and almost meant something. They sat in his office with the November light going gray outside the window, and the building humming around them. And it was ordinary in a way that felt, to Grant, like something he'd been working toward without knowing it. The official Halcyon Network indictments came down in December. 14 individuals across 3 countries, 17 shell companies dissolved, classified technology transfer cases referred to multiple agencies whose names appeared in the coverage as abbreviations that the news media translated with varying accuracy. Victor Sloan was among the 14. His trial date was set for the following spring. Grant read about it on his phone while he was waiting for Sophie's school holiday concert to start. He was sitting in a folding chair in a school gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and the particular mixed-age humanity of a public school, surrounded by other parents doing the same scanning of phones before the lights went down, and he read about the collapse of a criminal network that had touched his life in ways he was still in. And then he put his phone in his pocket because the lights went down. Sophie came on stage with the rest of the 3rd and 4th grade choir in a red shirt that she'd argued was not Christmassy enough and that had ended up being plenty Christmassy. She found him in the audience immediately. She always found him, with the same reliability with which he found her, and gave him the small private wave that she thought was subtle, and that was not subtle at all, and that he loved completely. He waved back. They sang 4 songs. Sophie knew all the words to 3 of them, and improvised confidently through the 4th, which he could tell from the slight rearrangement of her expression into the focused blankness she deployed when working with incomplete information and expression that he had realized recently, and with a specific complicated feeling, was exactly his own. She got an ice cream cone on the way home. He got coffee. She told him on the drive back that Madison had finally admitted that dolphins might be at least as smart as dogs, which Sophie described as basically winning in a tone that suggested she was being generous. He said, magnanimous in victory. What's magnanimous? Generous when you win. Not rubbing it in, she considered this. I didn't rub it in, she said. I know. I thought about it, she said, with the particular honesty that she deployed unexpectedly and that always caught him off guard. That's fine, he said. Thinking about it is human. She licked her ice cream and looked out the window at the December street, the lights on the houses, the specific suspended quality of the weeks before a holiday when children existed in a state of heightened anticipation that made the ordinary world briefly luminous. Dad, she said. Yeah. Is Evelyn your friend? He kept his eyes on the road. He said, she is. Is she a good friend? He understood the distinctions she was making, the 8-year-old taxonomy of friendship, where some friends were people you were around, and good friends were people who mattered. He said, she's a good friend. Sophie absorbed this. She seems nice, she said. When I met her that time. The time she'd met Evelyn had been accidental. Merely Evelyn had stopped by the office late on a Thursday, realizing Grant had Sophie with him because of an early school release day, and the introduction had happened in the hallway with the particular awkwardness of an unexpected social situation that none of the 3 participants had prepared for. Evelyn had crouched down to Sophie's eye level and asked, with genuine interest, what grade she was in, and Sophie had answered and then immediately said, do you know about dolphins? And Evelyn had said she knew some things, and Sophie had said she'd tell her the important parts, and they'd stood in the hallway for 7 minutes while Sophie delivered what Grant could only describe as a comprehensive briefing. Evelyn had listened to all of it. She is nice, Grant said. She's a good person. Sophie seemed satisfied with this. She finished her ice cream cone in silence and then fell asleep before they got home, the way she sometimes did in the car, her head tipped against the window, her breath fogging the glass. He carried her inside. He was carrying her more carefully now the ribs had healed, finally, and the shoulder was largely back. But he'd developed the habit of being conscious of his body in a way he hadn't been before the building. Delicate, just aware. The body had limits, and the limits deserved acknowledgement, which was something he'd spent his SEAL years overriding and his maintenance years ignoring, and was now, at 39, beginning to actually believe. January came. The investigation continued its slow, thorough work. Grant's 3 days a week became something the Carrington Aerospace Security Team relied on in ways that showed up in small operational improvements that nobody announced, better integration between the building's mechanical and the security cameras, a revised emergency protocol that actually reflected how the building's infrastructure worked rather than how the official schematics claimed it worked, a staff training update that Grant had put together with Evelyn's approval, and that described for the first time in the company's history what was actually behind the walls. He still knew where all the unofficial access panels were. He'd added them to the map now, because the point of them had never been secrecy, it had just been that nobody had asked. One Friday afternoon in February, he was leaving the building early, because Sophie had a half day and he'd structured his hours for exactly this reason when Evelyn caught up with him at the side entrance. She was in her coat, which was unusual, because she rarely left the building before 6. I have something, she said. He stopped. Good something or complicated something, she said. Walk with me. They walked. The February air was cold in the specific Seattle way, not brutally cold, but damp and settled, the kind that got into your jacket regardless of its quality. The street outside the Carrington Aerospace Building was ordinary midday city life, delivery trucks and pedestrians, and the particular Seattle phenomenon of people carrying coffee cups the way other cities' people carried umbrellas. She told him about the families, what she'd done. Carrington Aerospace, as part of its restructuring, had established a fund. Not announced publicly, she'd been specifically careful about that, because public announcements had a way of making private grief into a company story, and she hadn't wanted that. Quiet, direct, administered by a foundation at arm's length from the company. Education funds for Reeves's 3 children. A college scholarship in Ortega's name at the university he'd been accepted to before enlisting and never attended. Supplemental support for the families of everyone else whose service records were being once corrected as part of the Halcyon investigation. It doesn't fix anything, she said. which was the same thing he'd said to Maddox in the conference room on 44, and he heard her hear the echo of it in herself. He said, "It's right, though." "I hope so." She looked at the street ahead of them. "I've been thinking about what my father built. The company, the contracts, the relationships. Some of it was legitimate and good. Some of it was not. I'm not going to know for a while exactly where all the lines were." She paused. "But I know what I want it to be from here. What I want the company to be. The people who understand how things work shouldn't be invisible," Grant said. She looked at him. "You said something like that," he said. "After the server room." "I meant it," she said. "I still mean it." She stopped walking. They were at the corner of the block, the silver maple from Sophie's bus stop visible half a block down. Leafless now in February, the seeds long gone. "I've been thinking about something else too." He waited. "You could have left," she said, "that morning. When you fixed the brake circuit, you could have gotten out of the shaft and called it in and gone somewhere safe and let everyone else handle it. You had every reason to. You have a daughter. You had no obligation beyond what you'd already done." He said, "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly. The honest answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't about duty or identity or any of the things that would sounded right in a movie. The honest answer was simpler and more human than that. "Because you were scared," he said, "and you were alone. And I couldn't walk away from that." He paused. "It's not more complicated than that." She looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd been trying to name for months and had finally, recently, admitted to himself that he recognized. Because he'd seen it in his own face, in the years after his wife died, in the particular expression of someone who had organized their life around not needing anything from anyone and was encountering something that made that organization feel insufficient. "How to do this," she said. It was the most direct thing she'd said to him, maybe in all the months since the building. Layering, no professional composure, covering the thing underneath. "Which part?" he asked, though he thought he knew. "Any of it," she said. "The whatever this is. I'm not good at letting things be uncertain. I run companies. I like knowing the parameters." "I know," he said. "You're not going to make this easier, are you?" she said. An accusation. Just an observation. "I'm not going to make it faster," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. The February cold had put color in her face. She was not in this moment the CEO of an aerospace company, or the woman who'd stopped a data transfer, with her hands on a keyboard while the building fell down around her. She was a person standing on a street corner in winter, trying to figure out something that people had always found difficult to figure out. "Sophie has a half day today," he said. "I know. You mentioned it. She's going to want to make grilled cheese for dinner," he said. "She makes it every half day. She has strong opinions about the butter-to-bread ratio." Evelyn looked at him. "She mentioned something a while ago," he said carefully, "about showing you how it was done properly." "She mentioned that too," Evelyn said. "She was very serious about it. She's serious about most things she cares about." He held her gaze. "You could come," he said, "for grilled cheese. That's all it is. Agenda." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Kay," he said. They walked back to the building so she could get her car, and he got his, and they drove separately to his apartment because some things needed to stay that way for a while. Sophie was already home when Grant arrived. Her backpack dropped in the doorway in her standard configuration. Her shoes lined up next to it, with the toes toward the wall. When the knock came at the door, Sophie answered it because she'd gotten there first, which was typical. There was a brief conversation in the doorway that Grant could hear from the kitchen where he was getting the bread out. "Do you actually know how to make grilled cheese?" Sophie asked. "I've made it," Evelyn said. "I've had varying success." "That means you've done it wrong," Sophie said. "I'll show you the right way." "I would appreciate that," Evelyn said. They came into the kitchen. So Sophie had already appointed herself head of the operation and was pulling butter from the refrigerator. He'd intervened. Evelyn stood in the kitchen of a maintenance worker's apartment in February and looked around at the drawing stuck to the refrigerator, the box of animal erasers on the counter, the cracked Dabbert car that was visible through the window in the parking lot below. And then she looked at Grant, who was slicing bread. He looked back. Neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, because some things were better understood than stated. Sophie put a pan on the stove and turned it to medium, not too high. That's the first mistake people make, and began explaining the process with the confident authority of someone who had strong views and wasn't interested in debating them. Evelyn listened to every word. Months later, when summer came back and the silver maple at the bus stops full and green and dropping its seeds again in their slow spirals, there was an evening where Grant and Sophie walked home from the park, and Sophie's hand was in his, and she was telling him something about a book she'd gotten from the library. And at some point, she stopped talking and looked up at him. "Are you happy, Dad?" she asked. He thought about the Navy. He thought about Daniel Reeves and Christopher Ortega, whose service records now told the truth, whose families had something real to hold on to, whose names he still carried, but differently. Not as evidence of his failure, but as the names of men he'd served with who had finally received some partial measure of it. He thought about his wife, who had known him when he was someone else and loved him anyway, and who would have had opinions about every single thing that had happened in the last year, and whose absence was a thing he had learned to live inside rather than around. He thought about Evelyn and the shape of what that was real, and slow and not yet named, and not needing to be. He thought about grilled cheese on a February evening and Sophie's precise instructions about butter and a woman in a CEO's wardrobe taking notes with genuine attention. He thought about the elevator shaft in the dark and the cable roaring past and the 12 feet between him and Victor Sloan that he'd crossed without quite deciding to. He thought about the maintenance corridors and the emergency phone and the plenum space above 38th floor where he'd said 2 names out loud in the dark and heard them received. He thought about the morning he'd left for work 9 months ago, the alarm at 5:15, the note on the counter, the lunch packed, the shoes in the hallway. He thought about the man he'd been then, carrying something he couldn't put down, believing something about himself that wasn't true, doing the work of ordinary life with genuine love and genuine competence, while a whole part of himself stayed sealed off and unused, like an access panel that nobody had filed the paperwork for. Had spent years believing that leaving the seals had diminished him. The life he'd intervened, that the life he'd built for Sophie, the bus stops and the dinners and the notes on the counter was smaller than the life he'd had before. He had traded something great for something ordinary. He understood now, standing in the summer evening with his daughter's hand in his, that he'd had it exactly backward. The courage it had taken to drop into an elevator shaft was real. He wouldn't pretend otherwise. But it wasn't the hardest thing he'd done. The hardest thing he'd done was show up every day for a little girl who needed him, while carrying 9 years of false guilt and a grief that didn't have clean edges, without letting either one take him down. He'd done it imperfectly. There were days he'd been short when he should have been patient, days he'd been absent in the specific way of a person whose mind is somewhere their body isn't, but he'd done it. And it had been real courage, the kind that didn't get recognized, because it looked like just living. He looked at Sophie. "Yeah," he said. "I'm happy." She smiled up at him with the gap-toothed smile, the baby tooth long since grown in, but the gap still alive in his memory the way all the versions of her were. "Good," she said with complete satisfaction. "You seem like you are." She went back to telling him about the book. He listened to all of it. They walked home in the summer evening, under the maple trees and the particular slanted light of a season that was still full, and hadn't started turning yet, and Grant Holloway carried nothing he hadn't chosen to carry, and the weight of it was exactly right.